all days, I don't really like preaching from my manuscript, but I was like, today you might just want to do that. With, all the sleep I'm getting, the surplus sleep that I'm getting from having a 2-week-old and a toddler. It's great planning on our part, and we love it, and we're also totally exhausted. Like, anyone ever have experienced what it's like to have a newborn kid at home? Yeah. Anyone remember college when you didn't sleep at all and you thought, I'm still going to nail the paper? And we thought that was exhaustion? Word. So good. Just so you're all aware, Lyra May, I came up with a middle name, so I should know this. Lyra May Simone Chaddick was born May 26th, 5:37 in the morning, 8 pounds 4 ounces. She is doing awesome. She spits up way more than her sister ever did, so that's super fun. Yeah, it's the second child thing. Yeah. so weird and bizarre and amazing. And she's doing well at home. We got like the nursery set up and everything's good. And speaking of nurseries, Noah and the flood. Because how many parents built a nursery out of this story, Noah and the flood? Which is weird because the story is really primitive, right? There's a deplorable level to this story as well. It's really dark in a lot of ways. It's this primitive story about God destroying everything, and it's also somehow such a cute story that countless children's books have been written about it. And countless parents have, in fact, adorned their nurseries in art dedicated to this story. A story about God telling a religious man to build a large boat to stay safe from this God destroying the world with a global flood. Adorable. See, the world was too violent, and so God violently destroys everything except for some animals and Noah and his family. So cute. I think it's perfectly clear why this story's been used by parents in nurseries and for their babies and children. Totally. Makes perfect sense. Why not try and just freak the bejesus out of your kids from the moment they're born? We are in the midst of a sermon series about colorful stories of the Bible because for so many of us, colorful stories, strange and bizarre and violent stories like today, this tale of Noah and the flood, make the Bible so difficult and obtuse for so many of us. And for some of us, we read the story and we're like, yeah, see, the Bible's too primitive. I can't do it. I especially can't do the Old Testament. It's too primitive. It's too deplorable. When I was a student in seminary just a few years ago, studying the Old Testament, I kind of had this desire to just eliminate all the stories that made God look bad. Like, let's just get rid of all these kinds of stories. Can't we just say they're badly written myths that don't reflect our more progressive, enlightened understanding of God? And my professor said, no. And he had a great point. He said, these stories were written down for a reason. And they've endured for thousands of years for a reason. And our task is to uncover the why. Why was this story written? Why was it written the way that it was? And why has it endured? Because when we ask those questions, oftentimes what we do is we find something deeply revolutionary and transformative about a story that we might otherwise describe as primitive. So let's get one thing clear. It's a primitive story. It was written thousands of years ago. And let's get another thing clear. It's actually mostly an unoriginal story. It's a really common story, but it has this radical and progressive ending. And this is the place that I want us to start and to actually end up. First of all, it's an unoriginal story. Why do I say that? Well, thousands of years ago, every culture had their flood story. Like the Greeks, the Africans. Mesoamerica had their own flood stories. Everyone had a flood story. Having a flood story in your canon isn't all that interesting thousands of years ago. Everyone had a flood story. Everyone had a story about the world coming to an end because of a flood. And it makes perfect sense on some level, because if you are an ancient civilization, an ancient tribe, and you're trying to live, where do you pitch your tents in your community? By water. And what happens to rivers and lakes and oceans every once in a while? They flood. Now, because you don't have the scientific revolution and you don't have the scientific method, you try to figure out, why is it the case that sometimes the whole world seemingly floods? And what you do is you use narrative, you use myth, you use story as a way of trying to figure out why the world is the way that it is. You use stories kind of like scientists use hypotheses to make a guess. I think the world is like this. And we're going to tell this story to try and explain why the world is the way that it is. These stories that we would call myths. Well, myth just gets a bad rap today, because myth sometimes is seen as like an untruth. Myth sometimes is seen as like being less than factual. But for ancients, mythos, is simply a story that had more profound truth than could be contained in a fact. A myth described the whole universe, or at least attempted to. So there were tons of flood myths trying to describe the universe and why floods happen. And there were all kinds of flood myths. I'm sure you've heard of like the Epic of Gilgamesh, maybe. So the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian Sumerian text, isn't your typical Sunday morning read? Oh, I thought it was like right there with like the New York Times. You finish that crossword puzzle and you're like, and now ancient Sumerian texts. No? Okay, fair enough. I'm just weird. But we all do that. So there are all kinds of flood stories. Probably the one that most influenced a lot of the ancient Near East stories, and one of the oldest one, is about a guy named Zidsura, who was a high priest and a king. And the story goes that all the gods, there were lots and lots of gods, they created the heavens and the earth, and humanity was created for one purpose, or basically two purposes: to work really, really, really hard, to keep running the rat race, and to work and work and work and work to please the gods, and then to offer up sacrifices. And the sacrifice that was offered, the smoke that would go into the sky, you offered that to the gods because that's how the gods ate. They ate the smoke. So your whole purpose in life is to work really hard so that you can make a good enough sacrifice to the gods so they can eat, so they won't get angry and pissed off at you. This is a pleasant worldview, right? Work hard and sacrifice. And in the story of Zidsura, all of humanity wasn't working hard enough according to the gods, and all of humanity wasn't offering up good enough sacrifices to the gods, and so the gods decided to destroy everything. One god, or Enki, depending on which tablet you're picking up with your New York Times, it has two different gods, but one of the gods, suffice it to say, tells and warns Zidsura to build a boat and to save him and his family. And so the story goes that for 7 days and 7 nights, it rained and poured, and the heavens opened up, and the water fountains burst forth, and the whole world was flooded. But Zidsura and his family was saved, and then after this great global catastrophe, he exits the boat, and he builds a sacrifice, an altar sacrifice. And the gods didn't know, except for the one god, that this one human was saved, and they're just so angry that some humans kept existing. And so they come down, they're ready to swoop and kill this guy and his family, but then they're really distracted by the sacrifice, and they're said to swarm around the sacrifice like fleas. Pleasant, pleasant story. They totally are, they forget, oh, we're not pissed anymore because there's a good enough sacrifice. This is the story that provides the framework for most of the other flood stories in the ancient Near East. And there's some really fascinating things that we should tease about this story, that we should try and uncover and unravel about this story. The first thing that the story teaches us and all of humanity is that humanity was made just to work hard and sacrifice enough. The story also taught all of humanity that the gods are angry. And you never know where you stand with the gods, because at any moment they could just strike you down being pissed. And the third thing it says is the story was so prevalent that it dominated all other frameworks. This is how the gods are. They're angry. This is our dominant story. This shapes the way we see everything. This is simply how reality works. The story will never change. We will never know if the gods are angry at us or not. I know the story is like really old and it may feel like no way is that relevant, but how many of us, if we're honest, have an inclination that the purpose of life is to work and work and work and work and work, and to sacrifice and sacrifice to appease someone else? How many of us have the belief and operate with this myth that we're just supposed to work hard, be perfect, and offer perfect sacrifices? How many of us find ourselves believing and telling ourselves a story that the future will never be different than the past, that the future won't be different than today? Isn't it odd that ancient stories actually can speak to our lived experiences thousands of years later? And what's really, really fascinating to me is that the Hebrews, they knew the story of Zitzurah. They knew the flood stories. And they did something really radical. They were inspired to imagine and to tell a different story of the flood and share a new and emerging hypothesis or understanding of the divine and of the universe. Yes, this flood story of Noah is primitive. It was written thousands of years ago with even more primitive and backward story. But this primitive story is actually, this Noah story is actually progressive. It's about a God who detests violence. It's about a God who grieves. It's about a God who protects. It's about a God who remembers humanity. It's about a God who cares for humanity. It's about a God who, unlike in the other flood stories, this God at the end promises, in an intimate way, promises to never bring catastrophes to earth. This is a God who enters intimately into a relationship with all of humanity. Doesn't just get pissed at humanity, swarm around like flies, and then fly away, never have anything to do with humanity. This is a story about a God who cares to be in an intimate relationship with humanity. Not about a God who wants to wipe out humanity, but to save and live in relationship. Not a God of floods and chaos and destruction, but a God who moves beyond floods and chaos and destruction to bring rainbows and to bring beauty and to bring new life. So here's the fascinating bit to me. Again, the dominating narrative of this time was that the gods were angry and that all floods, all catastrophes were a result of the gods being angry and pissed and disappointed in you as a person. You weren't working hard enough. You weren't playing the game. You weren't running the rat race. You weren't sacrificing enough to make others happy. That's one hell of a story. And it's actually a form of hell. It's a trapping story. It's the kind of story that creates this relentless despair that things aren't going to get better, that this is as good as it gets, that tomorrow isn't going to be better than today. And it's easy for us in the 21st century to get sucked into telling ourselves very similar dysfunctional stories. It's easy to believe that how things were yesterday directly shapes tomorrow. To kind of say to yourself, I guess this is as good as my relationship is going to be. To say, I guess my marriage, my work, my career, my life, it's just stuck. It's easy to say, I guess I will always struggle and lose with my battle with addiction, or with food, or with despair. But this enduring story about Noah, a God, a flood, a family, and some animals has endured because at the heart of this story is this profound, progressive, and transformative set of ideas. One, the creator of the entire cosmos and universe, unlike in these other stories, isn't fundamentally an angry God. This is a God who protects and who promises, and it enters into promises with humanity, who serves humanity and doesn't demand perfection from any of us. But a God who doesn't remain aloof, but seeks intimacy. That regardless of what the story has been in the past, God is always inspiring us to write better stories about greater freedom and promises of life. The stories of our past do not have to haunt and define us. We are free to write new and more expansive stories. God invites us, encourages us into a future that is free from yesterday's stories. Our pasts do not have to define us. We can create a new future and a new life. So let's make this incredibly practical. If you find yourself today or any time recently telling yourself the story that your entire point of being, your entire existence, your entire purpose in your story is to work and work and work and work and sacrifice only to make others happy, if be it like God or your boss or your family, you are telling yourself an unhealthy story. It's a story rooted in perfectionism. And it's a story that ultimately will be rooted in bitterness. God wants you to tell a better story with your life. God isn't angry. God promises to work with you in your life, to help you see all the rainbows in your life, to see the beauty. God promises to be with you in the midst of the storms and chaos and griefs and losses. And if you tell yourself the story that any flood or any storm or any season, cloudy season that you're experiencing is as good as it's ever going to be, that there can be no better day after this flood, that your current or past struggles will always haunt and define you, let me tell you, you're telling yourself an unhealthy, dysfunctional story, and it's a story rooted in despair and shame. God wants you to tell a better story with your life. God is encouraging you to see past your past stories. God is encouraging you to see that your past stories may in fact be prologue, but they are never the epilogue. That the past is your past. Your struggles and your storms are your struggles and storms, but nothing lasts forever. And for every storm, there is a day. There is a day in which the bird comes out. There is a day in which you can see a bird with a leaf in her mouth. But there is a moment after the flood when all the colors do come out. But seeing this usually requires some kind of help. Noah had help from his family, from God, from animals. Sometimes to see the bird with the leaf in her mouth, sometimes seeing all the beauty, the color of all the rainbow, the color in the rainbows requires help. Sometimes to see the colors, we need help. Therapy, counseling. Maybe some of us need antidepressants. There are real storms. There are real floods. There are real moments of feeling and wondering, like Noah, will this storm ever end? And I love that this Noah story has a line in it that no other flood myth has. God remembers humanity. In every breaking wave, in every moment in which your heart aches, God remembers you. God sees you. God hears you and is calling you through any flood and every storm. My heart hurts today because this week a couple of really well-known people couldn't believe that. Thinking of Kate Spade, and I'm thinking of Anthony Bourdain. And I think church has to be the kind of place where we as a community name that there are people in the world and there are people in our midst, and maybe it's actually us who are having a really tough time seeing that this flood will end. And if that's you in your life, every breaking wave, every storm has an end. There is a new day. There is always a beautiful day awaiting. And there is always a God walking through the storm with us. I want to end by kind of rewriting a story. Let me give this back to you. And dropping my sermon notes. That's fine. There's a well-known poem, but I think the poem gets it a little off. It's a poem about footprints in the sand. How many of you have heard the story, the poem about footprints in the sand? It's so meaningful because, the storms and seasons in life, there's only one footprint in the sand because God was carrying us through. Oh, so sweet. And if that's been meaningful to you, that's great. But I think the poem misses the point. The poem misses what's at the heart of this story and what's at the heart of the Bible. The poem should actually go that when this individual was looking back on his life, he saw two footprints in the sand. Always. Because in the highs and in the easy moments when things were going well, Jesus, the divine, was walking with this person that entire time. And in the floods, in the storms, and the heartbreaks, the divine doesn't pick us up and carry us and make it easy. The divine carries us and our burdens and our storms by always walking with us. We get to be inspired by this divine poem story, by this flood story, by recognizing that God is always with us. And that we as a church get to walk through every storm with each other. That's divine community. That's being the beloved community. And that's what this story, this primitive, backwards, barbaric story has at its heart. I think that's why this story has endured. I think that's why this story, this colorful story, is a story worth telling. Amen.